Good morning, children. In Social Science History Class 9, the chapter Socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution, we'll take up the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, socialists took over government in Russia through the October Revolution of 1917. So, this is a very major event, the time of the revolution, which is called as the Russian Revolution. But in February 1917, the end of the fall of monarchy took place. Russia that time was ruled by the Tsar, that is the ruler, the emperor, and he was Nicholas II, who was ruling at that time. But in February 1917, this system of monarchy came to an end. So this is what we call as the Russian Revolution of 1917. In October, the Russian Empire in 1914. Now, in 1914, as we are aware, that Tsar Nicholas II ruled Russia. And besides the territory around Moscow, the Russian Empire included the present day, what we have today, the country, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. In Central Asia, we had the states of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So this was the empire in 1914. Now the major religion, the main religion or the major religion that people followed was that they were Orthodox Christians. So they were known as the Russian Orthodox Christians. And besides that, there were other people who followed Catholics, who were Catholics, Protestants, Muslims or Buddhists also. So these were the people, the different faiths that the people believed in. Now we take up the economy and the society at that time. At the beginning of the 20th century, we see that 85% of the Russian population were engaged in agriculture, that they were agriculturalists. Now, that was a very big number as compared with France and Russia, where they had much lesser percentage engaged in agriculture. Now, as a result of this, Russia became a major exporter of grains. How major exporter of grains? Because the cultivators, the people who were cultivating land, produced so much that they were able to produce for the market and their own needs also. That means that they were able to fulfill their own needs also, and at the same time they had enough to send to the market as well. So that is how they became one of the major exporters of grains. Then the prominent industrial areas, cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now here we had craftsmen also working at these craft workshops, and these craft workshops were close to the large factories. So some people were working or employed in the factories, large factories, and there were some people who were working in the craft workshops. And these craft workshops were close by, they were near these large factories. So if we see that in 1890s, many factories were set up. Now there were two major reasons. Which were these two reasons? One was due to the expansion of the railway network. That is, the railways expanded. So that was one more reason also why factories or the number of factories increased. And the second important reason was the increase in the foreign investment. So these two major factors enabled them to have a greater number of factories. So more factories they were able to set up. Now, if we talk of the expansion of the railway network, it was there. So, expansion of railway network took place. So, that resulted in more number of factories and also the foreign investments that increased. So, there were two major changes that took place in the amount of production that took place over there. One is the coal production. The coal production doubled. It became double. Why? Because of the support of the railways and the foreign investments also. And secondly, the iron and steel output increased 4 times. So obviously they had enough, or rather they had in plenty. So this, due to the expansion of the railway network and and foreign investments, one, the coal production doubled, it increased, and secondly, the iron and steel output, their production also increased, and it increased 4 times what they were producing earlier. Now, here we see that most of these industries were privately owned, and the government was supervising these large factories. Why the government supervised these large factories? So that they could make sure, or they could ensure that the workers would get minimum wages and working hours would be limited. So this was the idea of the government to supervise the large factories to ensure that minimum wages the workers would receive, and even their working hours were not too long as they used to be earlier. But factory inspectors were appointed, but rules were broken in any case, and they were not able to prevent exploitation of the workers. How these exploitation of the workers took place? In craft units, working hours sometimes were as long as 15 hours, while those who were engaged in factories or who were employed in the factories, they had to work for 10 to 12 hours. So we see that here also there was discrimination in the sense and exploitation of the people, particularly who worked in the craft workshops or craft units where their working hours were long. So we see that, as we discussed earlier, that we in France and Germany also, everywhere the people in Europe, one can say that these workers were exploited because they had no such unions and all at that time. So obviously there was nobody to speak on their behalf or anyone to support them. They did try, of course, and gradually they eventually succeeded also. Now, if we take up the situation of the workers first of all. Now, workers were a divided social group. Why? Because some people stayed on in the villages while some settled in the cities permanently, like cities like we talk of St. Petersburg. So, as a result, workers were divided on the basis of skill. For instance, if we take an example, a metal worker of St. Petersburg considered himself as an aristocrat. Why aristocrat? Because they required more training and skill than the other people. So all the other people, so naturally all those people who were metal workers, they worked in metal workers, they considered themselves to be aristocrats for the simple reason that they needed more training and skill than the other workers. So they considered themselves to be above the other workers. So that was the division that came about in the minds of the people among the workers also. Then we see that women also constituted about 31% of the workforce, of the labor force. So that was a high percentage, one can say, but the wages were not equal. What wages that were given to the men, it was lesser than what was given to the men. Sometimes it was half of what used to be given to the men, or maybe sometimes a little more. But definitely that 31% of the women were employed as the labor force, but wages that were given to them was much lesser than the men folk. So we see that there was division among the workers also. So gradually one can see that this level of dissatisfaction was increasing among the workers. And among the workers also, there were some who felt that they were superior while the others were not. Why? Because the people who were engaged in metal work, they required more skill and training. So they felt that they were as if that they were aristocrats, while the other people were commoners. Now, there were times, on occasions, there were few already, although some workers formed associations, they formed groups. Why? For the simple reason that there were people who were unemployed. So in order to help those people who were unemployed, or some who were facing a financial crisis or financial difficulties, so in order to help them, they formed these associations or groups, one can say, so that they could help these people when they needed their help. Either it was the fact that they were unemployed, or if they were employed, their wages were low, or any other difficulty that they faced financially, so they could try to help them out. They could help them and support them. And at that time, strikes also became common. That is, in the textile industry, if we take the example, between 1896 and 1897, many strikes or frequent strikes took place in the textile industry. Why? A strike means that when workers refuse to work. Why? Because their conditions are not what they expect them to be, that they are not treated properly, or rather they are ill-treated. So if their conditions are not good, obviously their work is going to be hampered, and their work is not going to be of that good quality also. So these strikes took place in the textile industry between 1896 and 1897, and in metal industry it took place in 1902. So these strikes were basically the coming together or the uniting of these workers in order to bring about changes in their condition, in the working hours, because they had been exploited, just as in the other parts of Europe. Here also the workers were exploited, and therefore they wanted these changes to be brought about in their condition, in their living and the working conditions, so that they could contribute more. Thank you.